South African Jews for a Free Palestine have welcomed the government's application to the International Court of Justice against Israel's continuous bombardment of Gaza. Last year, the South African government filed an application for the ICJ to begin proceedings to declare that Jerusalem was violating its obligations under the 1948 Genocide Convention in its war against Hamas. For more on this, we are joined by Bluen from South African Jews for a Free Palestine. Joe, thank you so much for joining us and for your time. And I guess before we go into the merits of all of this, let's just talk a little bit about South African Jews for a Free Palestine. It's all kind of said in the name, but just tell us a little bit more about it.
Hi, Masa. Thank you so much for having us on the show, and greetings to your viewers at home. South African Jews for a Free Palestine is a loose collective of anti-Zionist Jews, and we, on the one hand, absolutely stand against the Zionist entity of Israel, and we work in concert with our comrades here and abroad towards the absolute objective of a free Palestine. One of our key things, I think, and I think many of your listeners or your viewers will identify with this, is seeing struggles as interconnected. We know that anti-Semitism is connected to different forms of racism, of sexism, of Islamophobia, and seeing these as connected means that if we fight for one, we fight for all. And so many of us come from backgrounds, from ancestors who went through the Nazi Holocaust and the pogroms, came to South Africa, became white here through similar fascist processes that our ancestors lived and died under. And so we see it as a moral imperative, as most people of conscience do, to stand in absolute solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians. And to fight for a free Palestine, guided as we are by principles of morality, but also by key Jewish principles that support justice and freedom for all.
You know, speaking of key Jewish principles as well, there are many who would say that even the thought of calling it a genocide or calling for a ceasefire or any sort of peaceful solution is anti-Semitic.
I mean, Masa, what must we say to people who say that? I think that is just very clearly a manufactured set of lines, largely coming out of the Israeli state and the Hasbara propaganda machine, which has been doing work over the last few decades, especially, to conflate Zionism and Judaism. And I think it's really important to recognize that Zionism is a fairly new phenomenon in Jewish history. First of all, that most Zionism is Christian Zionism in many respects, and that Jews have historically been a diasporic people. We have been part of societies all over the world, globally, and it's only in the last few hundred years that Zionism has become part of a settler colonial ethos. Now, Zionism is not Judaism. Zionism is a corruption of Judaism. As we say in our statement, it is the vandalization of our faith, which we resent. So the idea, genocide is fundamentally antithetical to Judaism. We are guided by one of the key guiding principles of Judaism is tzedek. Tzedek is a good man, which means justice. So what we're seeing in the kinds of things we're talking about is a very carefully crafted media and propaganda campaign to conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And this is solely for the purpose of genocide, settler colonialism, in the context of the ongoing Nakba, which started with the apartheid establishment of the Israeli state in 1948. So in short answer, I was one of 800 genocide scholars and scholars of international law that signed a letter early on in the current instantiation of this genocide in Gaza, saying this is very clearly genocide. We have seen genocide scholars, international lawyers, Palestinians. We are seeing the bombardment of schools, of hospitals, the killing of children, the forced starvation, clear genocidal intent and genocidal rhetoric. There's absolutely no doubt, and I say this both as a Jew, as a human, as a South African, and as a scholar of international law and genocide, that this is, as Raz Siegel, who is an Israeli Holocaust and genocide scholar, says, a textbook case of genocide. So really anyone who is trying to say otherwise is very clearly part of a propaganda machine supporting this genocidal onslaught in Gaza.
Now, when you heard the news that South Africa will be filing this application to the ICJ, how did you react as an organization? Were you feeling pretty proud? Also considering that you're talking about struggles being interconnected, and when we look at our history as well, it would have been amiss, would you say, for South Africa to keep quiet?
I think you're absolutely right, Masa. And I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that South Africa, and by South Africa I mean an anti-apartheid South Africa, has since really the establishment of the international legal order as we know it, been an active player in trying to unpick some of the colonial aspects, because we know that international law is a deeply colonial place. And so we look, for example, at the work of Oliver Reginald Tambo on the Apartheid Convention, right? We look at the Durban Conference on Racism in 2001. South Africa has been on the front lines in legal spaces, in deeply colonial legal spaces, in pushing towards justice for in the face of colonial violations of international law. So I think that's the one thing to kind of contextualize this. And so if you look at the Genocide Convention itself, it not only outlaws genocide, but highlights that there is a duty to prevent genocide by all states that are party to the convention when we see it happening. So I think South Africa is acting on this, and we are very, very proud of our government for doing this. And at the same time, and I think it cannot be overstated, that there is, and if you look at the opening, I think it's paragraph 2 and 3 of the text in highlighting that kind of situation, while the submission itself is focused on Gaza, this genocide is situated within a 75-year-long apartheid ongoing Nakba in Palestine, right? And I think the very fact that in 1948, both the Genocide Convention was approved by the United Nations General Assembly, but also both South Africa and Israel were established as apartheid states. So what we're dealing with is quite specific here. It is not only an invocation of the Genocide Convention, but it is an invocation of the Genocide Convention within the context of ongoing apartheid. And that is profound. So on every level, in respect to that, we offer our warmest congratulations and support to the South African government and the excellent legal team that put together this remarkably meticulous submission to the ICJ calling for provisional measures.
Now, it's actually quite courageous as well, considering that South Africa isn't this huge, powerful superpower country, yet it's taken this stance and, drawn the line in the sand pretty clearly here. The Israeli government has been very adamant to say that they will defend this application, and they have basically rubbished it. And of course, we've heard those similar sentiments, if not exactly the same, coming out of the White House as well. What does it mean for a country like South Africa to be going against superpowers like this?
I think that's a really, really great question. And I think, certainly in my experience, South Africa holds quite a specific standing within the international community. Partly, I think, because, in light of what we've spoken about earlier, there has been this mass push from South Africans fighting apartheid to kind of and many Africans really from all over the continent and the global south to kind of push to change or to use the tools of international law in the service of anti-colonial ends. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is, sure, we have the superpowers, and I think, when we talk about Israel and the US's response, we need to understand that on the day that South Africa submitted the submission to the ICJ, the US approved a waiving of congressional oversight to release masses of arms, masses of billions of dollars worth of arms to support the genocide in Gaza. So Israel and the US are both equally complicit in this genocide. And so, of course, they would be castigating, in quite frankly, in some of the ways I find quite racist ways, to refer to something by a predominantly black legal team as meritless, besides the geopolitical attempts to support genocide. This is also a familiar trope, right, in a white supremacist legal context. And at the same time, I do want to say that we've seen tremendous support for South Africa's application, right? We've seen lots and lots of support both on the ground and from various states, and more states are coming out in support of this. A final point I'd like to make on this, if I may, is that we also know, as is very clear, that the Israeli, what is called hasbara, which literally translates to explain, but has come to be understood as the Israeli propaganda machine, has gone into overdrive because they are deeply fearful. They are deeply afraid of this case, whatever the outcome. This is a statement within the legal architectures of which it is a part, that its actions are unconscionable. So we have seen the Israeli government send out notices to all its embassies, calling for, number one, a discrediting of this, and number two, and when we see this, for example, in the constant use of the rape allegations in deeply unfeminist and deeply anti-women and anti-queer ways, we have seen this as part of a propaganda machine to undermine the case, because they are a desperate nation, and they are losing so much credibility, and I think this case just emphasizes that.
And speaking of the outcomes, Joe, we've seen this continue where international laws have been flouted already. What are the chances that those who have been complicit, such as the US and, of course, Israel as well, coming out of these hearings at the ICJ will actually see proper repercussions?
It's always an interesting question, because I think the law, on the one hand, is a juridical field or a judicial field where judgments are handed down, and on the other hand, it's a symbolic field, right? We know that the Nuremberg trials didn't actually do as much as they say they did in terms of accounting for the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, and still stand as a symbolic gesture. So I think that's the one thing. On the other hand, and I think this is very important to bear in mind, while the ICC has shown itself to be deeply complicit with colonial power and white supremacist power, the ICJ has a very interesting history. So we have, we've seen quite recently the Chagos Islands case, where Mauritius brought a case against the United Kingdom for the continued colonization of the Chagos Islands, where there is also a U.S. military base called Diego Garcia. And the court ruled in favor of Mauritius and said there had been an incomplete decolonization of the Chagos Islands. We saw in the 70s a series of cases against South Africa, apartheid South Africa, for its continued occupation, apartheid occupation of then Southwest Africa, of Namibia, and we saw the court ruling in favor of that. We saw the court ruling against the United States in the case of Nicaragua. So I think, and of course the Palestine Wall case, which deals directly with Palestine. So I do think that the International Court of Justice despite having its roots in the United Nations architecture as the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, which is a colonial architecture, we have seen some really impressive anti-colonial rulings from the court. Now, whether those in power, those in the global West in power that are ruled against, uphold their obligations under international law remains to be seen. And Israel is known to be a flagrant violator of international law. However, the court itself there is more likeliness, given its history, and given that it has shown itself to be, unlike the ICC, capable of ruling in favor of those who fight on the side of justice and against genocide.
Sure. Well, Jo, thank you so much for your time and your insights this afternoon. That was Jo Bluen from South African Jews for a Free Palestine,